There is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be, and any report of a famine in Russia today is an exaggeration or malignant propaganda. So said Walter Durrani on the Holodomor, a famine that claimed the lives of 3.5 to 7 million people. Walter had been the New York Times Moscow correspondent since 1922. He won his Pulitzer in 1932 for a series of articles on Soviet economic planning. He lived well in Moscow, had access to Stalin that other journalists didn't, and understood implicitly what that access required. Gareth Jones told the truth. He was 29 years old. He had walked through the dying villages himself. He had the testimony of survivors, the evidence of his own eyes. Walter had none of that in a Pulitzer. The Soviet system didn't create the denial alone. It found willing partners. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. Not that a totalitarian state lied about a famine it caused. That's expected. But that the institutions of the free press, the diplomatic establishment, the Western intellectual left chose to believe the lie because the truth was inconvenient. The Holodomor occurred from 1930 to 33 and affected a wide variety of regions, but most crucially, the highest grain-producing ones. Major factors included the forced collectivization of agriculture as a part of the first five-year plan and forced grain procurement from farmers. Massive investment in heavy industry decreased the agricultural workforce. It is estimated that 5.7 to 8.7 million people died from starvation and 50 to 70 million starved, but survived. It was the cost of the industrial machine, one that chose to continue despite millions of deaths. Whether or not it was purposeful is still debated to this day, as well as whether it was an ethnic cleanse. Stalin's motivation to finish collectivization in the five-year plan is one argument it was purposely negligent. If the cleanse isn't supported, scholars go on to mention the class dynamics between kulaks, landowner proprietors, and their belief in private property, which went against the Communist Party. During collectivization, Stalin ordered the liquidation of kulaks. This led to overall persecution of them, as well as arrests, deportations, and executions. Some kulaks responded with acts of sabotage, such as killing their livestock and destroying crops designated for consumption by factory workers. The party's goal of rapid industrialization also played a role in worsening the famine, as the party chose to continue industrial growth rather than remedy the famine. This is another indication they were readily aware of the famine. In 1929, Jones was a professional freelance reporter, and in 1930 became foreign affairs advisor to the British MP Lloyd George. This afforded him privilege in his position he otherwise wouldn't have. Jones was in Leipzig the day Hitler was elected chancellor, and also met Goebbels. He was no stranger to difficult foreign entanglements. By 1932, Jones had been to the Soviet Union twice, for 3 weeks in the summer of 1930, and for a month in 1931. He had reported the findings of each trip in his published articles, including 3 titled The Two Russias he published anonymously in the Times in 1930, and 3 increasingly explicit articles, also anonymous, titled The Real Russia in the Times in 1931, which reported on starvation among Russian peasants along the Volga River and German colonists near Dnipropetrovsk in Soviet Ukraine. On March 29th, Jones issued a press release detailing what he had witnessed. I walked along through villages and 12 collective farms. Everywhere was the cry, "There is no bread. We are dying." This cry came from every part of Russia, from the Volga, Siberia, White Russia, the North Caucasus, and Central Asia. I tramped through the Black Earth region because that was once the richest farmland in Russia, and because the correspondents have been forbidden to go there to see for themselves what's happening. In the train, a communist denied me that there was a famine. I flung a crust of bread, which I had been eating from my own supply, into a spittoon. A peasant fellow passenger fished it out and ravenously ate it. I threw an orange peel as well into the spittoon, and the peasant again grabbed it and devoured it. The communist subsisted. I stayed overnight in a village where there used to be 200 oxen, and where there are now 6. The peasants were eating the cattle fodder and had only a month's supply left. They told me that many had already died of hunger. 2 soldiers came to arrest a thief. They warned me against travel by night, as there were too many starving, desperate men. "We are waiting for death," was my welcome. "But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south. There, they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people already dead," they cried. Durrani opposed this vehemently. He was quite the hypocrite, admitting the Stalinist system's brutality and defended its necessity. On March 31st, 2 days later, the New York Times published on page 13 of its paper a denial of Jones's statement by Durrani under the headline, "Russians hungry, but not starving." Durrani called Jones's report a big scare story. This shifted the story, making it far more feasible to the general public. The Soviet regime could work with Durrani's approach. His article claimed, citing multiple Soviet and foreign sources, "There is no famine." Part of the New York Times headline was, "Russia and foreign observers in countries see no ground for predictions of disaster." On April 11th, Jones published a detailed analysis of the famine in the Financial News, pointing out its main causes: forced collectivization of private farms, removal of 6 to 7 million of best workers, or kulaks, from their land, forced requisitions of grain and farm animals, and increased export of foodstuffs from the USSR, for which he wrote, "It is not so much the Soviet government as the world crisis, which is to blame." What are the causes of the famine? The main reason for the catastrophe in Russian agriculture is the Soviet policy of collectivization. The policy of Paul Schaeffer in 1929-30 that collectivization of agriculture would be the nemesis of communism has come absolutely true. My first evidence was gathered from foreign observers. Since Mr. Durrani introduces consuls into the discussion, a thing I am loath to do, for they are official representatives of their countries and should not be quoted, may I say that I discussed the Russian situation with between 20 and 30 consuls and diplomatic representatives of various nations, and that their evidence supported my point of view, but they are not allowed to express their views in the press, and therefore remain silent. Journalists, on the other hand, are allowed to write, but the censorship has turned them into masters of euphemism and understatement. Hence, they give famine the polite name of food shortage, and starving to death is softened down to read as widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. Widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. Consuls are not so reticent in private conversation. After this passage, Jones was informed he would never be able to visit the Soviet Union again. Durrani coordinated with other Moscow-based correspondents to collectively dismiss Jones's account. November 1933, the month the United States extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, is 8 months after Jones's reporting. The State Department had been seeking recognition throughout 1933. Durrani's version of events was considerably more convenient for that negotiation. In private, he acknowledged the system's brutality. He once wrote that, "You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs," when discussing Soviet methods, a casual acknowledgement. Historians made arguments reflecting the historical complexity. Alexander Dallin of Stanford wrote, "There is no evidence it was intentionally directed against Ukrainians. That would be totally out of keeping with what we know. It makes no sense." Terry Martin of Harvard stated, "Nationality was of minimal importance in this campaign. The famine was not an intentional act of genocide, specifically targeting the Ukrainian nation." David Shearer, publishing from Cambridge, writes, "Although the famine hit Ukraine hard, it was not, as some argue, a purposely genocidal act against Ukrainians. No evidence has surfaced to suggest the famine was planned." Adam Ulam of Harvard wrote, "Stalin and his closest collaborators had not willed the famine." But on the other side of the table, other arguments were brewing. Timothy Snyder says it was a deliberate act from Moscow. The famine in Ukraine was political, a result of choices made in the Kremlin and the knowledge of their consequences. Robert Conquest, in 1986, agrees that it was a political tool. This was not a natural famine, but a man-made, deliberately contrived famine. A key takeaway from his work is that Stalin used starvation to crush Ukrainian national resistance, reducing a fertile land to a melancholy desert. Andrea Graziansi is a noted scholar in Soviet history. Graziansi argues that Holodomor was a methodically planned genocide, using starvation as a weapon against the producers of food in a region known as the breadbasket of Europe. Jones was murdered in Mongolia in August 1935. He was 29 years old. The circumstances were never fully explained. Durrani died in Florida in 1957. In 2003, the New York Times conducted a review and concluded Durrani's work was some of the worst journalism ever to appear in the paper, but stopped short of recommending the Pulitzer Prize be rescinded. What isn't disputed by either side is that the Soviet leadership received detailed reports of mass starvation, throughout 1932 and 33, they knew. Internal documents confirm they knew. The response was to seal the Ukrainian border, preventing starving peasants from leaving to find food elsewhere. Historians will continue to debate the question of intent. What isn't debatable is the response. They sealed the border. Collectivization was achieved. It didn't matter what it took to get there.